Welcome to Dyscastia, a podcast for parents and teachers about the best way to support kids living with learning difficulties. I'm Michael Shanahan.
And I'm Bill Hansberry.
And today we're talking about what's changing in schools around reading. But before we start, we want to acknowledge that we're casting to you today from the traditional lands of the Kaurna people.
And we would like to pay respects to their elders past, present and future, and acknowledge their deep connection to the land that we are on today. Michael.
Absolutely. So here we go. There's a big question because we get this question a lot from parents. And things have really changed in the world of reading, particularly in South Australia. So what is it that people need to know about these changes in teaching reading, Bill?
Well, I guess there's a context to this, Michael. Yes, you and I do get asked, and schools right now who have changed how they teach reading to be in line with about 30 years consensus of scientific evidence about how the brain learns to read. The schools that are making this change now are having parents ask them, particularly parents who have a younger one in, say, reception or year one, and they've got an older one who may be at the other end of primary school and they're noticing a difference, right? So what's changing? Well,
so how did it used to be? So,
okay, that's probably a good place to start.
What is it that people would be used to seeing? So if they're a teacher or a parent, what's been kind of the status quo up to now?
The status quo, well, it's a really good question, not a very straightforward answer without because not being nuanced in this can end up being insulting to certain people, but here we go anyway. There's this ideology around how we should be teaching reading, and it's pretty much dominated in Australia and other developed countries for a really long time. Some people call it whole language, some people call it whole words, some people call it balanced literacy, which was an attempt to balance out this other way based on whole words with phonics teaching, really structured, sequenced teaching of what we call the code, which letters match to which sounds. So in the 70s, 80s and well into the 90s, and in a lot of schools now in Australia, and some people will still argue most schools, the teaching of reading is based on this idea that children learn to read words by memorising whole words, right? And it harks back to basically knowing how children learn to speak. So we know that when kids are born, unless there's a language disorder evident, and there is for lots of kids, but for lots of kids there isn't. Unless there's a language issue, children learn to speak just by being around people who speak their native tongue.
Yep.
So there are regions in the brain ready and raring to learn language, spoken language, to understand it and to speak it and to make words. Okay, so that's natural. That is inbuilt.
Yep.
There is no hardware in the brain to learn to read, or for that matter, to learn to spell.
Yeah, because it's like a technology, isn't it?
That's a really good...
We're not born knowing how to type on a keyboard.
That's exactly right? So this is what some people refer to as biologically secondary knowledge. It's stuff that we've got to put in. So the logical fallacy that went was, okay, we know that if we immerse children in spoken language, they will just learn to speak. Okay. So before we could watch the brain while it reads, and we can now, thanks to technology like fMRI and all sorts of other really sensitive scanning technologies, before that idea that children learn to speak just by being around speakers translated over to reading. We had this idea that, well, if kids just learn to speak by being around speakers, they will learn to read if we immerse them in the printed word.
Yeah.
And they will just soak it up.
Yes.
That turns out to be absolutely wrong. In fact, it couldn't be further from the truth.
It's interesting, though, because it did catch on.
Yes.
And it probably caught on because, and I imagine this is still the case, for a portion of kids, they do quickly learn to read. So there are a good probably 30% of kids that will learn to read even if we don't teach them. Like they're just such good language and phonological processes that they do actually kind of pick it up. And so it's easy to say, okay, well, look, it's working. These kids are all learning to read because we've taken this approach. But from my understanding, the problem is if you're not one of those lucky kids, this approach can actually make it harder for you.
Yes. Nancy Young has put together this model called the ladder of reading, and that outlines which percentage of kids will learn to read in a whole language or whole word environment regardless of how it's taught.
Yep.
I use an example. If you've read To Kill a Mockingbird or seen the story, Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird talks about how she just learned to read by sitting on her dad Atticus's lap, watching his finger go along the print.
Yep.
So when I talk to teachers, I say, so we do have these kids, we call them the Scouts, who regardless of how they're taught, they just magically soak it up. Yeah. So you watch these kids and you would go, oh, learning to read must be natural.
Yeah, look, here's the proof. And that's, as people who, as someone who comes up with a theory, I'm on the lookout for proof that my theory is correct.
Yes,
because that's
right.
how we operate as people,
it's
isn't it?
Confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias, yeah. And so when I do it and I say, here's proof, it's working, and I've been doing it for years. So, Bill, what are you talking about?
This
right. does work. There's just kind of a bunch of lazy kids.
Oh, here we go. Yes.
Who don't work as hard.
Yes.
Or their parents didn't read to them.
Yes.
And that's the problem. It's not the way I'm teaching.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's, I can totally understand why someone comes to that conclusion.
I've got my hand in the air because that was, look, I didn't get taught in pre-service teacher education really anything about how kids learn to read or how to teach them, regardless of the system, right? Yep. So where was I headed with this? Yes.
Yeah. So that's the whole reading history.
Yes.
And it is, as you say, a bit of it's kind of turned into a belief now, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Because the science has now shown that this is not actually the case. Even though it might look like it, this isn't the case. This isn't how it works.
No, and all you need to do is have a look at Australia's reading results. Roughly still a quarter of our year nines are at or below minimum reading standards. So you have a look at what we spend on education in Australia, and then you have a look at our results, particularly compared with other developed countries around reading proficiency. The 2011 Pearls study had Australia ranked 27th, I think, right, behind all sorts of countries. We were bottom of all English-speaking countries. Now, there's been a few Pearlses since then, but we haven't made the progress you'd expect. We haven't moved up that ladder in a way you'd expect when you have a look at what we spend on teaching or what we spend on kids in schools.
And what a privileged country we are.
Yeah,
You'd
that's
expect us to be progressing further.
So we've been massively underperforming, right?
Which is another little piece of evidence to say maybe this approach isn't working.
Well, it's leaving too many kids behind, Michael.
Yeah.
So yes, you've got your Scouts, and then you've got this whole proportion of kids, 40 to 50%, who will get by with just a little bit of phonics teaching, but primarily a whole language type of approach, right? Mm-hmm. But then you've got this really vulnerable set of kids, and it's around 20%. And these are the kids where dyslexia falls into this category, and perhaps other language processing difficulties. But you've got a fifth of kids who, unless they get this highly structured, code-based instruction by teachers who really understand how to teach it well, these kids are left behind. And Mark Lemessurier referred to this as Australia's dirty little secret. The fact that in such a developed country, teachers like you and me just accepted the fact that 1 in 5 kids will leave our classroom probably having made no progress over a year in their reading.
And we didn't really know what to do about it, so we just kind of, it's not to say that people were callous about it.
No.
It's that, what do we do? You know what I mean? Right. Like, how do we fix this?
Yes.
For a period of time we didn't know, but now we do know.
Yeah, we do.
And I suppose this is the change, isn't it?
It is the change,
the science is in.
Well, it has been in. Look,
it has been in for a long time.
Yeah, that's right. Now, this is not something that you can ever blame a single educator or even a school for, but education or teaching is notoriously slow for following research and being heavily driven by ideology.
Yeah,
we reckon ideas. So Mark Seidenberg puts this really well in a book called Language at the Speed of Sight. He's actually brutal around educational or education settings inside of universities, educational faculties, saying these folks are terrible when it comes to aligning how we teach teachers right, around with the science of reading.
Yep.
And he says, so what is it? Where does this leave teachers? Well, Pinterest, the internet, and very vulnerable to all
teachers
sorts of...
pay teachers.
Don't get me wrong. There's some good stuff on there.
There
You
is.
just got to know what you want.
Yes.
Yeah, so it leaves us very vulnerable to ideology. It makes us very vulnerable to, instead of basing our practice in the evidence, going next door and going, Michael, how do you teach kids to read heart words? How do you teach kids, tricky words? And taking your advice on that instead of having a look at what pretty much a 30-year consensus of evidence says about how to teach this, which captures most kids.
Yeah. And because a lot of that information is fairly inaccessible because it's very academic and technical.
Yes.
And it actually takes a lot of time to wade through and try and understand it. You know what I mean? And a teacher's job is incredibly stressful and busy. How do you take the time out to do that?
No teacher's got time to wade through journals, right? And the thing with reading research, it doesn't just come from one field. It comes from linguistics, cognitive psychology, neuroscience, right? To name a few. So there are many, many different types of periodicals which publish research on reading, right?
Yeah.
So there are these conduits.
Yeah. So despite all this difficulty, so rather than blaming individuals, which we're not, this is a circumstance. This is a set of circumstances that have meant we haven't progressed as quickly as we could have and things haven't improved as well as they could have. But I think what you're saying now is that things are finally taking off and things are changing and we are starting to follow the science. And this is where it gets a little bit confusing, isn't it? Because getting back to where we started, parents and teachers might be noticing a shift in the landscape here.
Yeah.
And we're here to try and explain what's happening.
That's right.
But you kind of need that bit of history and context.
You really do. So what's going on? Well, number one, let's talk about the type of reading material that's going home with littlies when they are first starting to learn at school, right?
Yep.
Once upon a time, these types of readers called levelled and predictable texts would go home. Now, Alison Clark has an excellent explainer on this. She's the Spellphabet lady from Victoria.
Brilliant set of resources, fantastic website.
The woman's a national treasure.
She's great.
I would encourage people to go and have a look at a YouTube clip called What's Wrong with Levelled and Predictable Texts, or it could be Predictable and Levelled Texts, but you'll find it.
She explains it beautifully, doesn't she?
So let's do this in a nutshell.
We'll put that in the notes.
So what was going home were readers with sentences which were not what we call phonically controlled. So the sentences made up of words which were made up of letters that had not been explicitly taught to kids in a classroom. So
and quite difficult letter combinations.
Yes, like
boat.
Yes, camel.
Yeah.
Now you might, a proficient reader will go, what's hard about boat and camel?
Yeah.
Well, you've got all the code. Yep. Right, you have all the mental equipment that's been taught to you to know that. You know them by sight.
You know the O-A actually makes an O sound.
That's right.
Not an O-A. It's not bo-at.
That's right, and it's not B-O-T-E, boat, right? So what we're dipping into here is the complexity of the English orthography, or AKA our spelling system.
Yep.
So we have this complex spelling system. So we were sending home these readers, look at the boat, look at the swing, look at the camel, but without having taught explicitly the connections between the sounds those kids have in their heads and how they're represented by letters. So these readers would also have pictures.
Yep.
And they would have, as I alluded to, they would have this repetitive part of the sentence. Look at the boat, look at the camel, look at the swing. This is Lucy, this is Tom, for instance, right? I'm not reading from anything, I'm just pumping it out of my head.
Yes.
So what that would get kids doing is it made a lot of youngsters look as if they're reading.
Yep.
Because of that highly repetitive part of the sentence. And then if they didn't know the word like boat, camel, swing, they would look at the picture.
Yep.
So what that does...
And I have living proof of this with my son.
Yeah.
Because we thought he was reading well. Because we were parents that read every night before we went to bed.
Yeah.
We would read, and we'd often read the same books, so it was quite repetitive. And I remember a time when my wife accidentally skipped a page. But He read the page that was skipped.
He'd memorised it.
We thought he was reading these books as we
yeah.
were flipping the pages, but when we flipped the page, he read what was on the previous page and was like, hold on a sec, you're not reading this at all. You've just learnt it.
So I'm interested, Michael, what happened next?
Well, that was one of the triggers where we went to speak to the school and say, hey, well, we went a little bit further and we started trialing him on just reading random pages, that he hadn't memorised and realised there was an issue here and went to speak to the school to say, we don't think he's actually reading. He's just memorising this stuff.
Uh-huh.
Unfortunately, the school's response was, he's fine. Don't worry about it. He'll grow out of it.
That's how they all learn to read. Michael, I'm glad you kept telling that story with a bit of prompting, because this is what is going on when these books go home. Mm-hmm. So what happens is, and what's been happening in all developed countries is, there's been this cohort of kids who have looked as if they're reading, but they're actually not, okay? They're using this approach called contextual guessing, or multi-cueing, or 3-cueing, which, by the way, was for a long time an accepted model. It looks like a Venn diagram of 3 overlapping circles that says proficient readers take cues from context, they take semantic cues, where's the word in a sentence, what is it doing, and the bottom one is phonic cues. But you see, the problem is in that Venn diagram, phonic is only 1/3 of it. The rest of it is basically guess.
Yep.
So these kids, our scouts, our very low percentage of kids who learn to read no matter what, that's fine, they move on. But what's going on in their brain, Michael, is they are cottoning onto this thing called the alphabetic principle. They are on their own tuning into this insight that each of those letters represents a sound.
Yep.
Okay?
Yep.
Or sometimes a group of letters like OA in boat represents a sound.
And their brains are just wired that way that they get it.
Well, it's yes. Not to say that they were born with equipment ready to learn to read.
That's right.
But they do this job very easily. They tune in on this idea that these squiggles on a page stand for sounds, and their brain then very quickly, through an incredible statistical machine, starts to make solid bonds between those letters and groups of letters and sounds. So eventually they're storing words with ease, and eventually they're storing whole words with ease, and eventually those words just pop off the page because they have this incredible sight word vocabulary, and for all intents and purposes they look like, and they are, a proficient reader. Okay? But then we have about 20% of kids. Now, people will shoot me on this because it might not. It's around 20% of kids.
No one knows because no one's done the research, particularly in Australia. There's some research, but it's a bit fuzzy, isn't it?
Look, we kind of at the moment talk about this 1/5, of kids who their brain doesn't do that, and it's based in how the brain processes speech sound, right?
Yep.
And if you want to know more about this, look into the importance of phonological awareness to orthographic mapping. Okay, this is where it'll take you. But there's this group of kids who don't get that insight.
Yes.
So what they're trying to do is store these words as pictures, or have attempts at these words based on the context, the words around it, or the picture. And so you get these, so these kids start making these lookalike errors, ghost for goat, horse for house, right? And teachers will be nodding their head right now because they see it all the time.
Yep.
Or the picture will be something, the word will be entirely different. The picture's a goat, the word's house, and the kid reads goat.
Yep.
Okay?
Yep.
This is not
I see it every day.
Yeah, you do. And I know because we're both specialists in this field, Michael.
Yep.
Yes. So these kids rely heavily on guessing.
Yep.
And it is not reading, because that is not what a proficient reader does when they strike a word they don't know. Proficient readers fall back on what we call their phonic decoding, and they will very quickly sound it out based on their letter sound correspondences that they have stored in their head.
Yep.
So this is our issue. These kids trick us. They look like they're reading until about year 4. And the phenomenon is called the year 4 slump.
Yep.
It is well documented. And we finally find these kids out when they start reading more complex words, which will come with more complex reading material.
Yes.
Okay, words of 2, 3, 4 syllables with maybe some Latin and Greek kind of roots in them.
Yep.
And all of a sudden the kids that aren't decoding, that aren't linking the sounds in their head to those letters or groups of letters, they are found out. And everyone scratches their head and goes, well, this kid looks as though they were reading.
Yep.
And what gets said to worried parents is, don't worry, it'll click. But it doesn't, because these kids they have not been taught in a way to give them the tools they need to progress from there. Yeah.
And I've heard that year 4 slump described as kind of a transition from learning to read to reading to learn. And so while I'm learning to read, the guessing and those strategies that I've developed to fake the fact that I'm reading work. But now that I move into, okay, now here's a bit of text to read and you need to learn this on your own, and it's words that are unfamiliar that I haven't seen before.
Yes.
I go into a panic of I can't understand this. So the impact isn't just on their reading, but it's on all of their school performance, because now they don't have the skills to self-teach. They can't read a book or a textbook and understand it.
That's exactly right.
It's an even bigger impact than just on the reading.
That's right, because all of a sudden there's this whole myriad of skills that have not automatized, right? Phonic decoding being one of them. So these kids use up all their mental workspace on either trying to guess from context or trying to sound out and decode based on a pretty flimsy framework.
Yep.
They're using all their mental space for that. So you can forget comprehension. You can forget free space in their brain to think about what they're reading, to monitor, is this making sense to me? So this is where this thing called the Matthew effect kicks in, where those kids who are reading with ease, the rich get richer.
Yep.
And the kids who didn't get this type of instruction, who needed it or didn't get the intervention, they're the poor and they get poorer, because you've got this whole cohort of kids who the very act of reading is teaching them to read, and you use the term self-teaching.
Yep.
The researcher is David Scher, I think, came up with this probably a decade ago. So there's a group of kids who are now self-teaching. The very act of reading new material is teaching them to read, but then you've got this other
and they understand it. They
do.
can read a
They're
piece
away.
of text in a textbook and understand it and do their homework.
They are away.
Or, yes.
That's right.
Yep.
And the other kids, Michael, we know them very well.
Yeah, we know them very well. My kids are like this.
Yep.
Even now in high school, even at university, my kids will come to me and with a textbook in hand and go, I have no idea what this says.
Yep. Yeah.
They can read it.
Yes.
But there's no capacity in their brain for understanding, because the reading part is so hard.
Yes.
And we've got to go through it together.
We only have limited workspace, Michael, in our brain, working memory. And if you've got a disorder, you're using everything around doing the letter sound matching stuff, because you don't have these words are not stored and your brain is just not giving them to you.
It's hard work. And, well, actually today my daughter had a PDF that she had to read and she just couldn't read it. She tried 5 or 6 times and nothing was going in.
Yep.
So we set it up on her computer to read it to her.
Yes.
And she's as happy as Larry.
Yep.
Like the computer speaks it to her and now she totally gets it and understands it, because that capacity is freed up to just listen and understand.
Absolutely. And there are, Michael, 3 in 10 adults will tell you. That's my experience.
Yep.
Every day.
Yes.
And these people are highly functioning members of our community.
Yep.
But I'll tell you this story. Yeah.
Okay, so we have this older approach to teaching reading.
Yes.
That science has now shown has failed.
Yes.
Schools and institutions have been slow to change, but they are changing. We've had a history of these readers coming home that are levelled readers.
Yes.
Where kids, they have predictable pictures, predictable patterns and predictable words. So kids look like they're reading even if they're not.
Yep.
But now that's changed. And so whereas those levelled readers would have been coming home with kids, what's happening now?
So now,
what change can we see?
Schools are now sending home a type of reader that we call phonically controlled or decodable or phonic readers, okay? So they come under these terms. And look, you explain this to anyone and they'll go, this makes perfect sense. So what happens now is a teacher may, in the first weeks of school, teach the letters SATPIN. We call it SATPIN, and it's a pretty good analogy for any controlled phonic sequence. So the letter S making S, A making A, T making T, P making P, I making I. So notice with the 2 vowels, the A and the I, where they're only teaching the short sound of them.
Yep.
So they get taught in the classroom, okay?
Yep. And those letters are chosen because they give you a lot of flexibility because they're the most, well, some of the most used letters.
That's right.
I think S starts more words than any other letter in the English language.
Those phonic progressions, because that's what we call it, were developed when people grabbed the most regularly used words or the words you see in most sight word lists, but really you're right. They are the letters and letter combinations that get kids reading as many words and spelling as many words as possible early on.
Yeah, quickly.
That's right. So the teachers taught SATPIN. So what goes home? Readers that only contain words that can be spelled from those grapheme, phoneme or letter sound associations.
Yep.
So that's the only way you get kids not guessing. Now, so the problem is with that, Michael, is a parent who had a kid who had the leveled and predictable text go home, looks at these and goes, understandably says, wow, well, isn't this a come down?
Yeah. Because it's so hard to write a compelling story when you only have those letters to work with.
Right. And
there's only a limited number of words you can use.
And if you ever tried to write a phonically controlled passage, boy, oh boy, that smacks you right between the eyes.
It's hard work.
The literary quality dies immediately. But hang on, this is a
one of the big criticisms, yeah.
And all of a sudden, so a kid with SATPIN is reading words like is, sit, sat, it, tin. So, you don't get war and peace out of those words, do you? Stand.
No, you
right.
can't have stand.
No,
that's got an at in it.
But you see, this is the only way we can get youngsters to trust grapheme, phoneme or letter sound correspondences. And
it gives them success.
It does.
Which is very important.
Michael, I have never seen a child, particularly in our field, go, gee, I'm disappointed with the literary quality. This doesn't have much lexical depth, Michael and Bill. Because they know their reading.
Yeah.
And these are the very skills we have to encourage.
Yeah, what you actually see is the smile growing on their face.
Yeah.
Because for many of them, they're reading for the first time.
Yes. Now, so what are the criticisms of this, Michael? Number one, it looks far less sophisticated.
Yep.
Number two, parents go, well, look, the other part of this is developing kids' language, building new vocabulary. This won't do it. And you know what? They're dead right.
Yeah.
And the knockers of this approach have this concern. They're not wrong, but you see, if you want a child to access better literacy or literary content, you read to them.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between what you get the kids to read to you and what you read to them. So it's really important that parents still grab the really cool stories off the shelf with those
and do the shared reading. Yeah.
But listen, don't get your kids to decode words that have sounds that they don't know yet. Now, if the child wants to have a go, let them have a go, but correct them.
Yep.
And you might go, oh, you haven't learned that one yet.
Yep.
Now,
and it's kind of like I understand that criticism, but I think it's taking the process out of context.
Yeah.
In that, going back to the tennis analogy.
Yes.
It's like taking your kid to a tennis coach and your tennis coach doesn't immediately say, okay, now do a full overhead serve.
That's right.
One of the most complicated things, and just keep doing it until you can do it.
Yeah.
Actually, the first thing is how do you hold the racket?
Correct.
So this is the how do you hold the racket equivalent, isn't it? This is just like teaching the very basic skills.
That's right.
Because without these skills, without that proper racket grip, you're never going to be able to do a successful serve. So this isn't the end of the picture.
No.
This is just the very beginning of the code and how you understand it.
And there is no doubt in the research, this is a consensus of evidence, right? And you don't get this in everything, but there is no doubt that this way of teaching teaches more kids to learn to read and spell, because I also have to add, the kids are also spelling with those, right? So this is the teaching of reading and spelling going together. This is what happens in this highly structured way of teaching.
And the blending of sounds.
That's right.
So it's not just that decodable reader. It's a whole package there. And, I mean, I wonder if part of the criticism or, reluctance to do this is a speed thing because it feels really slow.
Yeah, it does.
Like it feels so slow that we're starting with these really basic words. You're tempted to make it more complicated and get them moving faster. But I'm always surprised, it feels really slow, but I'm always surprised how quickly following this, structured process,
yes,
how quickly actually those letter sounds build up.
They do.
And it gets quite complicated fairly quickly. It's just these early stages
that seem
a bit, too restrictive, but it's not like that forever.
No,
it's
that's
just
right.
the very beginning.
It is the very beginning. It's like slowly starting an engine, but it does build up very quickly because what happens is a student's got I and P. Very quickly their brain will start to see an I and P and give them IP.
Yep.
Okay? And when SH is introduced, IP is already bonded.
Yep.
So they've got ship.
Yes.
And then we talk about suffixes and they've got ships. And then they've got shipping and shipment. And so what the brain is doing when we teach this way is bonding these sounds in the head, these sound combinations to combinations of letters, and things just build up.
Yep.
So look, I've really poorly started to explain a process called orthographic mapping or bonding, but this is what goes on and that's what makes it take off. Now, this captures far, far more kids. Yep. It leaves far fewer behind, but we have to acknowledge there are kids who will still need intervention.
Yes.
But schools that teach this way, to this tightly structured and sequenced method, have far less kids who need intervention.
But that intervention isn't doing anything different.
No.
It's just giving them more time and more repetitions of the same thing because they need that to get it to stick.
That's right, because of that subtle difference in the way their brain is dealing with sounds and being able to pull sounds apart.
And you may need to address, with those kids where it's not working, you may need to go and address what position is your mouth in when you're making that sound.
That's right.
Because they may not even be making that sound. Because that's a tricky one to make. So if you can't make that sound, you can't hear it in a word, the whole thing gets muddy. So
it does.
The intervention isn't anything different.
Yes.
But it might just be breaking it down even further to even smaller skills that they might not have.
Michael, I'm glad you went there because this all begins with sounds. Our alphabet, A through to Z, is a Phoenician alphabet. We have a spelling system that is based on linking sounds, speech sounds, to squiggles on a page, right? So when you think about it that way, what other way would you teach reading and spelling other than putting sounds and their connection to letters at the very middle of it?
Yeah, exactly.
It seems common sense.
And understanding, and this is something that I don't think many kids understand, it's the sounds that come first.
Yes.
And the writing is a record of the sound.
Correct.
But I find kids tend to sometimes look at it the other way around and they think, I'm speaking like this because that's how it's written.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And, and it gets quite confusing when you think about it like that because, kids don't think about accents.
No.
Just talking about the fact that we have a slightly different accent and so that's why that word doesn't quite make that proper at sound.
Yeah.
We make an R sound instead because we're South Australian. Like it's complicated and I think that kind of nitty-gritty nuance is what the intervention is. For those kids that are finding it really tough, it's not that you're doing anything different, but it's that you're going into more detail at a slower pace and more repetition to make it stick.
Yes, and that detail is important because if your brain is not doing this really easy work with sounds, you need more hooks.
Yep.
You need more concept to hang things on. So talking about the letter A making the sound R, in our system, we know that it'll probably do it in front of an S, an F or a TH, right? So like in bath or ask, okay?
Yep.
We teach our kids that, whereas other kids, our scouts who are flying along, just kind of statistically store that letter string and know A makes R there.
Yeah, and for them it's just like, whatever, like I totally accept it and just get it and just automatically know that that's making an R sound there without necessarily having to think it through.
That's right. So people might be listening and going, okay, so there is this highly detailed way of teaching. Do all of our kids need it? And are we slowing down our scouts if we teach it to all of them.
Yep.
I really want to stress something, and it's a saying, but it's true. This type of teaching is helpful to all and harmful to none.
Absolutely.
So I'm working indirectly with a lot of schools who have implemented this phonological awareness training in their early years, and the structured synthetic phonics, this nothing left to chance. And boy, oh boy, these teachers had to go to work on their own knowledge around our spelling system and its rules and generalizations.
Because most of them are probably scouts. Most of them are probably people who have ended up teaching because they find this stuff easy and love it.
That's right.
And they're experts at it.
Yes.
And so it's kind of hard for them to understand that someone could even struggle with it.
Yeah, that's right. They say that gifted sports people can make the worst coaches, because it just came so naturally. You know? So yeah, you're right. So these schools are noticing when they look at their data, number one, they are picking up that vulnerable cohort of kids. Their results are much, much better.
So it's doing no harm.
It's doing no harm. It's also seeing the scouts develop faster as well.
Oh, okay.
So if you imagine a distribution, now I'm picturing in my mind a box plot. Now some of you know what a box plot is. So you're
holding your hand.
I'm holding my box plot. So I've got my upper and my lower limits, and the whole thing
everyone moves up.
It picks up all kids. It makes our strong kids.
So even the kids that are scouts and good improve.
Yes, they do. They do. So I think we just need to forget that this is leaving our scouts behind. It is not. It is bringing depth, greater understanding about our system through the teaching of morphology, right, which comes in after the phonography, right, or the phonology, giving them far greater depth in how our language works. And these kids, their vocabularies explode. Nothing's left to chance, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a classroom, when you're teaching in a classroom, in any classroom, you're catering for kids that are struggling and kids that are excelling.
It's a broad spread.
You give them extension exercises.
Yes.
So, yes, you introduce the basics to them, but if they're a scout and they're well beyond those basics, you can give them an extension exercise at the same time as giving something a little more intensive to the kids that need the support. So it's not totally vanilla delivery of the information to the group. There still can be variation within a class.
There can be, which is now we're into differentiation, right? And I've got some views on this in my blog, and probably disagreed with by a lot. But this is why we have intervention, Michael. This is one of the reasons. There are kids who are going to need to be taught in a different setting at this different pace with these far more exposures and this far finer grained teaching, right?
Yeah.
And that'll have to happen out of a classroom. But you're right, they're still being taught the same code. And we can catch a lot of these kids up with an evidence-based intervention. Not all of them, Michael, but a lot more of them than we otherwise could.
Yep.
However, in these classrooms, we actually can teach the same content to the whole class.
Yep.
They will engage at different levels and may need to be assessed at different levels. But when we get this fundamental base teaching right, we don't have to be pitching to so many different levels in the first place. Now, differentiation is important, but I would argue that the current thrust on differentiation has come about because of pretty shoddy teaching earlier on, which has generated such a broad span of ability.
Yep.
So this ends up being a cyclical argument, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But look, that's just my take on this. There's a model of teaching called explicit direct instruction, which is a trademark type of teaching, which a lot of schools are picking up, and that argues that we shouldn't hold our kids who are a bit further behind away from the basic content, because if we teach it well enough in the beginning, we can teach them all a certain bit, but then branch out from there. Yeah,
and that's what I was thinking of when I was describing it. I was thinking, yes, you deliver that piece of information. It's hard to think of an example, but, here's the chunk. We're doing the letter sound today.
Yep.
We all practice how to write it.
Yes.
We all practice how to make that sound.
Yes.
We might talk about voice and unvoiced and v.
Yep.
So everyone gets that chunk of information.
Yes.
It may be that the kids who find that more difficult have a worksheet or something that they're working on that focuses just on the sound because that's what they need to work on.
Yep.
But the kids who are the scouts and have just got it might now be reading a decodable reader with the letter in it straight away. So that's the kind of differentiation I'm thinking of. Not that you've got to teach something different, but you might have an extension activity for a kid that finds it easier.
Yes, that's right. There's so many ways you can go with the letter F. You know, we can be teaching some kids that if we suffix a word like loaf that ends in ES, the F makes a V sound, right? There's also the rule about double F after a short vowel on the end of a one-syllable word, like buff or cuff. So just that simple consonant or that sound F with a consonant F has a number of layers and levels to it. But you're right, you can differentiate that way. But eventually we need to teach all of the kids those nuances.
Everyone still needs to get the basic instruction.
Right. Yeah.
You still need to know how to hold a racket.
That's a great analogy.
You still need to be reminded, even a professional tennis player who's now serving double faults all the time, their experienced coach will come to them and say, hey, you've lost your grip.
Yes.
Your grip's shifted.
Or your ball toss is not high enough.
And they'll go, thank you.
Yes.
You know what I mean? It often does come down to the basics.
You know, it does. You'll see professional athletes mouthing to themselves, watch the ball.
Yep. Follow through.
Yes, that's right. So, basically, in a nutshell, this is a style of teaching that leaves pretty much nothing to chance. It is a whole part whole type of teaching that says this is a skill. Proficient reading is made up of many sub-component parts.
So let's have a look at what do you mean by whole part whole? Because that's an education term, isn't it?
Well, it's
you
a
and I
PE
know what
term.
it means. Me too.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually a skill learning because apart from being a PE teacher, I spent some time doing train the trainer. So it was like training people to be trainers.
Yes.
And whole part whole is part of that just basic skill training package.
Yes.
Of this is how you teach someone a new skill. And it's basically you show them the whole skill.
Yes.
Then you show them the individual parts that are needed to make up that skill.
That's right.
They practice the individual parts. They put them back together as a whole. So it's whole, part, whole.
When you said putting them back together, you will hear the term synthetic phonics.
Yep.
Okay, and I'm glad you said that because we are teaching these kids. You look at the word sit; its parts are s, it, right? We are teaching kids to synthesize.
Yep.
Those three letters and those three sounds together.
So there's the whole part whole.
Yes, that's right.
The word sit and then the parts and then the whole.
Some people would argue in structured synthetic phonics it's probably part, whole. If you want to be really But yes, it's this break it into its component parts and then synthesize them back together. Whole part whole might be categorized as analytic phonics, which is not as doesn't have the efficacy of structured synthetic, but analytics might say let's look at sit. Now only if we have to, let's break it into it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's really I think structured synthetic phonics is probably better explained part whole.
Yeah. So here are the individual things you need, and now here's how to put them together.
That's right. So if you're a parent. Yeah, watch next time your kid is on the tennis court or anywhere else in a sporting area getting really good instruction about a skill, and then think about how they're these decodables, and it's not a hard thing to connect.
Yeah, riding a bike.
Yeah, that's right.
You start with training wheels.
That's good. That's spot on. Yeah.
Then you held.
That's right.
You held. So these first sat pin readers are really the equivalent to training wheels or holding onto the seat while the kid's learning to ride.
Yeah.
Because they're not ready yet.
No, the word scaffolding
comes to mind. And if you suddenly, chuck a book at them, they're going to fall off.
Or they'll guess away.
Yeah, that's right.
It'll be sad as said, house as horse, or house for goat or goat for horse, or you know what I mean? And a lot of parents will nod their head. They've seen this. It's not reading.
Yeah, and the problem I find with the guessing is that these kids are smart.
Yeah.
So there isn't any problem here with them doing a really good job of guessing from context.
No.
So they're really good guessers,
and
they practice it and they get success with it, and then that becomes a very hard habit to break. To say to a kid who is reading, who has already got issues around reading and they're hyper aware of the fact that they're not reading well, the last thing they want to do is slow down.
That's right.
But that's what they really need to do in those initial stages. They need to slow down and actually read what's there.
Yeah.
But that's a really tough thing to get a kid to stop guessing.
It is. It's like me saying to you, Michael, look, mate, sorry, walking forwards is not right. You have to walk backwards everywhere now.
Yep.
It's a really poor terminology.
And as soon as you're not looking at me, I'm going to turn around and walk forwards. Or if my friends are looking at me, I'm going to walk forwards. Or I had to read in front of the class, I'm going to start guessing because I don't want to look like a fool.
No, that's right.
And so what we're saying here is that this change that's coming about hopefully avoids the habitual guessing that is encouraged and taught through that whole word process. I mean, is that one of the worst things that comes of it? Like apart from the fact that, it's difficult to read and, you don't learn to read, I kind of think this habitual guessing is a real bugbear of mine because, as someone who works with these kids a lot, it's a really tough nut to crack for me. It's hard to get the kid to think differently and stop that guessing. And I talk to the kids a lot about it, and they see when they're doing it, but they can't help it because it's so habituated. They know they're doing it, but they can't help it.
I've recently graduated a young lad, a beautiful kid, who even at the end, and he went on to high school, and the parents and I made the decision we'll take our gains, right? At the very end, this youngster was still guessing more than I wanted. And I said to him, mate, did you have a teacher anywhere along the line who said to you, read faster, read faster? And he said, yes, I was. And he then recalled this with complete clarity. He said, I was in year 3, I think. We had a visiting teacher. My teacher went to have a baby, and we had this other teacher, and she would always tell me off and say, read faster, because if you're not reading a certain amount of words a minute, you can't go up a next level. Okay?
Yep.
So, and that was incredibly hard to undo, that panicked horse for house, adding of is, quickly adding in words or taking out short function words to fit a context that you're building in your head that actually isn't in the print. So for some kids, they can get over it with a bit of good instruction once they start to trust the grapheme phoneme correspondences again. And some kids are just really heavily in it.
Yeah,
it's hard to pull them out.
It's hard to pull them out. And so this new approach will hopefully stop some of that happening because we won't be actively encouraging them to guess as a strategy.
Yeah.
But we'll be taking them through step by step.
And I might argue this very old approach, Michael, because the grandparents of these kids, primary school age kids now, or maybe their parents, will remember heavy duty phonics teaching in primary school, albeit with the cane and other things that weren't so cool. But phonics was how this was taught. Probably trying to think when whole language really took off in 70s. But before
that's when I was at primary school.
Yeah,
I definitely had whole language.
So did I. Yeah.
What was it? Dick and Jane and
Pam, Sam and Digger. I'm trying to work out whether that was phonically regular. I don't know, but yes, it was part of the furniture. And you talk to people who taught before this, and they said when this whole language stuff came in and it swept in, right? A lot of them said I kept teaching phonics, but when the principal walked into the room, I stopped. But I knew it was getting better results, but I would be chastised for teaching it.
So it's kind of like the whole word experiment has run its course
and failed.
And now we're back to where we were before that experiment started.
You could look at it that
with
way.
a much more sophisticated understanding of it.
Well, an understanding of why it works.
Yeah.
So you look at people who are theorising disorders in reading, people like Samuel Orton. This is where Orton Gillingham or OG comes from.
Yeah.
Samuel Orton in the 40s recognised this group of kids who were struggling. He came up with this term strethosymbolia, which was letter blindness or congenital word blindness. But Orton knew there was this cohort of kids who were very bright, who were not locking in the code. So you look back, way back. We're talking half centuries, almost a century now.
Yeah.
This method of remediation for these kids was heavily code-based. It was phonics on steroids,
Yep.
just like what we do now is. So the effective intervention for reading difficulties has never changed. But for some reason, the global teaching of reading and spelling did. Well, look, if you can't match letters to sounds, you're sunk for spelling it. You know? Even in a complex, sometimes irregular orthography like ours, it all starts with sounds. Think about the word yacht.
Yep.
Y-A-C-H-T. Looks like yacked or yatched. It's still 2/3 regular, Michael.
Yep.
A Y always makes a Y or a Y sound.
Yep.
A T will always make a T. It's just this ACH in the middle. So people will go, why do we teach this? Because you get these irregularities in words. Well, it's not that bad.
Yeah, that's right.
It's really not that bad.
And if you do understand the history of that, I find that actually gives kids who struggle a real hook.
Because it once in its
because
language of origin.
they actually remember that story.
Yeah, the yacht.
I have, by coincidence, just a couple of weeks ago, I did this word with one of my students, and she thought it was brilliant.
Yes.
And now she just says, yacht. And that's how she remembers it, and she thinks it's funny.
Yes.
And now that word is just no longer a problem.
That's right.
Because she gets it.
Or said was once pronounced said.
Yeah.
And I said to him, or the spelling of two, TWO, comes from twin and twix, like we were talking about last time.
Yes.
There are these reasons. Our spelling system was pretty well thought out.
Yeah.
We just need to teach it.
Yeah. And so getting back to what we wanted to talk about today, what's the message we're trying to get across here about this change? It's a positive change.
It is a positive change. From the outside, it looks like a dumbing down or a winding back. Schools are having uncomfortable conversations with parents saying, we're actually teaching it a lot better now. Really sorry about your older ones.
So there's some pushback from parents here on this?
More questions.
Right.
What's going on here? Why does this look so different? And why didn't my 11 or 12-year-old get this?
Yeah.
So, schools are kind of sometimes feeling quite red-faced. And there's no other way to be honest with your parents. You go, look, this is how we should have always been doing it. But this is not the fault of teachers. This was the rage that swept through education, and it wasn't just in Australia. It was in developed English-speaking countries, and, whole language took the world by storm. It was based on a very intuitive idea that kids learn to speak just by being around speakers. So let's just put them around words and read to them lots, and they'll soak it up.
And it really does feel like that's how we do it.
Yeah.
Like intuitively you think it's probably correct. It's only when you get down to the nitty-gritty and actually studying the science of it that you go, hold on a sec. This isn't quite what we thought it was.
That's right, because the person who reads with ease forgets how hard it was to learn to read. And when you read with ease, whole words are jumping off the page at you.
Yep.
Whole words. You're not decoding much unless you strike a word you don't know.
Yep.
So, again, you get this logical fallacy, this intuitive idea that, well, I read whole words, therefore we should be teaching whole words.
Yep.
But that is not understanding and not taking into account all of those processes that our brain went through to get there, because the brain was never, ever built to read.
So if I'm a teacher and my parent is saying, so let's say you were this teacher, Bill, and I'm a parent coming and saying, why is this different? What are we saying to them? We can't. What is it in a nutshell? We can't say what we can't go over this last 30 minutes. What should schools be saying to parents? Do you think they should be proactively communicating this, perhaps?
A lot of schools are.
Yep.
A lot of schools are getting right on the front foot. And some of them may use this. And if this helps their parents, brilliant, right?
Yep.
But in a nutshell, this way of teaching that you're seeing now has the weight of evidence behind it to date. and it leaves far fewer kids behind, and it also teaches our stronger readers. It teaches them better as well, so it's not dumbing down. Big sigh. We should have been doing this all along. However, education broadly lost its way for a while.
Yep.
But we now have all of the evidence we need. Now, we don't exactly know how the brain reads, but we've got a pretty good idea, right? This is what we know works best. And, we all wish we knew what we know now when we started teaching.
Yep.
There's really no other way around it. I don't think we can spin and fluff our way around that fact that as a country, we got it wrong for about 30 years, you know?
Yes.
I don't know how else we broach this.
Yeah.
And it left far too many kids behind.
Yep.
Yeah.
Now, what's this running records thing I hear of? So I heard that running records is stopped. And was that running records part of this levelled reader historical process?
Yeah. Running records was a way of assessing kids' reading based on the idea that our good readers, when they strike unfamiliar words, will guess from context or picture. In fact, that's what was assessed. Can a student do this? Do they go back on this 3 cueing skill set when they don't know how to do it?
And so that's good, how kids will put up levels.
Yes, that's right.
So if your kid, was reading level 1, they would have a running record test done on them.
Teacher would observe them reading with a really detailed check chart.
Yep.
Are they doing this? Yeah. And unfortunately, the things on that teacher check chart were not supported by evidence. Those attack strategies were not evidence. In fact, they're damaging. If we teach kids to do that, we damage their reading, sometimes irreparably.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so then they would go up a level.
They would go up a level.
And that would be the celebration. Yes.
Yes, you've moved up.
I've moved up. My reading has improved.
Yep.
But what we're saying now is not necessarily.
No. Again, our scouts, off they went.
Yeah.
But what their brain was doing was storing letter sound correspondences. They were mapping 1 out of 5 kids were not.
Yep.
Because all they had is the context, the picture, and they were the kids we were seeing in this year 4 slump.
Yeah.
Right? And it's too many. I think anyone listening would agree 1 in 5 kids who does not become a proficient reader by an adult, it's not good enough in a country like Australia. It just isn't. You know, I don't think anyone would argue, no matter where your kid sits on that spectrum of ableness to learn to read.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what have we got as an alternative now? Because there's something quite nice as a parent to be told, hey, I've gone up 2 levels.
Yeah.
And I often have parents coming here to me and saying, hey, my kid went up a level and we congratulate them, because you don't want to poo-poo that.
Yeah.
What's that being replaced with now? As a parent, how do I know if my kid's doing better? What is it we should be celebrating?
Yeah, growth in reading age. The problem with these levels, Michael, is they were assessment tools built into these programs. Okay, so they weren't what we really need to be doing when we assess a kid's reading or spelling or comprehension or whatever is we need to be using normed assessments where they have assessed the skills of literally tens of thousands of kids, put at a particular age, put ability on a bell curve, on a distribution.
Yep.
Right, worked out where the mean is.
Yep.
Worked out the standard deviations, and then we can assign reading ages to kids. We can say at chronological age 13, this kid is at reading age 13. They're going well. We need these well constructed assessments that say your child is in this percentile.
Yep.
For their age, or is it this reading age? Percentiles clumsily convert to reading ages. They're not perfect, but that's really the only defensible way of giving feedback on a child's progression or progress. Not this small or no, sample program within program stuff, which basically sold programs, but wasted a lot of potential. Yeah,
reinforcing itself.
That's right.
Along the way.
That's right. Yeah, so a self-licking ice cream, Michael.
The problem with those statistics and where we're talking bell curves and percentiles and so on is that most people probably have no idea what what you're talking about
well,
when
that's
you talk
right.
about that. And so it's like, as a parent, I go, I don't know, like, but how do I know if my kid's improving?
Well, that's right. So what do you do with levels? You go, well, Michael's kid's on level whatever, and Charlotte's kid is on level whatever. My kid, so you know, we're always doing this kind of measuring. But it's ineffective. It's damaging. And by the way, you know, schools aren't going to be sharing data with. But you see, if we've got this reliable percentile stuff, so you know, what's the harm of explaining percentiles to parents?
Yeah.
Or if you're going to match it to age. Michael's a chronological age 7 years and 5 months. He's decoding a chronological age. Or 7, let's say he's 10. Michael's 10 years, 5 months. He's decoding as a 6-year-old. We know we've got a problem. We reliably know we've got a problem.
Yep.
Okay? There's intervention needed 2 years ago.
Yeah.
But we'll start now.
Yep. Yeah, that's right.
Instead of this, I've seen lots of boys stay on level whatever for a long time, but don't worry, it clicks.
Yep.
And I've been guilty of saying that before I knew better.
Yeah. I find those ages tricky.
Yeah.
I find those ages tricky because I think they're a little bit misunderstood.
Yeah.
And particularly for a kid, to say to a 12-year-old kid, you're reading like a 6-year-old is a bit of a bitter pill.
Oh, you got to word it very carefully.
Yeah. And so the ages are really tricky.
Yeah.
I find that kids and parents do understand percentiles.
Yes.
So, you know, if you think of a percentile as there's 100 kids in the room.
Your exact age.
Yeah.
Yep.
Then, 100 kids. So, thousands of kids around the world, your age, if they're all in a room, you'd be in the top 10%.
Yeah, if you're at the 90th or above percentile. Yes, that's right.
If you're at the 90 or above.
The sting is still the same, though.
The sting's still the same,
But these kids know they're struggling,
Yeah,
Michael. They're not oblivious to this. But if we do quantify it, even if it's hard in the beginning, then they see their progress, Michael. We start working with them and they see things start to shift.
Yeah.
In non-word
your
decoding.
reading age has grown a year.
That's right.
In the last 6 months.
That's right.
For example.
That's right.
To be able to say that to a kid, they're thrilled.
Because they're starting to move.
Yeah.
I had this one boy who came to me, he was, year 7, and I plotted it on a graph and I said, mate, this is what your primary school's been like. This is the flat line. Look what's happened in the last 6 months.
Yep.
Right? You just show it to them.
Yes, yeah.
Progress breeds motivation. You know, success builds success. But
it is a little bit more complicated, isn't it?
Yeah.
Than just saying level 1, level 2, level 3. There's something very, what's the word when something's nice? Seductive. It's very seductive to just say, I've gone from level 1 to level 2.
It's very gratifying.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It's so easy to understand and sounds so impressive. Sounds more impressive,
That's right.
Like, sounds more impressive than, you've gone from 25th percentile to 27th percentile.
And who says science isn't sexy? Well, that is, you're right, that is less sexy than you've just gone from level to level. That's right. Yeah.
You're 10 and now you're reading like a 6-year-old instead of a 5-year-old is not as impressive as, hey, you've jumped 2 levels.
But we all have to be smarter than this, don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. How have we gone, Michael? Do you think we've given enough of a background and a context to this change?
I think so. I hope so.
Yeah.
Because it's a complicated thing. There's so much history that you need to understand.
Yes.
And there's so much emotion involved in it.
Of course there is.
Because these are our precious kids we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And reading is so important. And it's very difficult emotionally to give up on a way of teaching that you really are invested in. You really do believe from your own evidence that this works. And now someone's saying you need to change because science says this.
That's right.
That's a really hard mental shift.
It is. And if you've been teaching this whole language balanced literacy way, you will rightly say, I have seen this work for a majority of kids.
Yep.
But when we pull that apart, and we realise it's 20% of kids who don't make adequate progress, roughly speaking.
Yeah.
We all agree that's not good enough.
Yeah.
So there's been an unconscious unawareness of the fact we could be doing so much better.
Yeah. Or you could flip it on your head and say, if you were able to successfully teach kids using what we now know as a flawed method, imagine how brilliant you'll be
Yeah.
if you start teaching using science and evidence.
The possibilities.
You will go from being a great teacher to being an incredible teacher.
Yeah.
Because now all of a sudden you're actually teaching the way we know people learn to read.
Yeah.
Rather than saying, I've got to give up on something, you're not going to go backwards by taking this on, you're going to go forwards.
And the bar has gone up so much, Michael. If I had a buck for every experienced early years primary teacher who has said to me, I never thought they could learn this fast. I never thought they would understand this as quickly. I hear this all the time. Littlies are flooring their teachers, seasoned teachers who have taught many, many children with the progress and the speed of this growth. It is like a rebirth.
Yeah.
For and some people have left the profession based on it, Michael. Some people have said, no, I believe this whole language balance. This is just another edu trend. This too will pass anyway. I'm tired. I'm out.
Yeah.
People have left schools because of it.
Yeah.
Teachers have moved on to other schools.
It's a very hot issue.
It is a hot issue.
And I can't stress enough how much it's not about criticism of individual teachers.
No.
But I think having a positive view of it to say, yeah, you're going to become a better teacher by doing this. And, you were just saying how teachers have been amazed at the results they've got.
Yeah.
I see kids that are amazed by it.
Yeah,
So I sit with a kid and I show them something, say, like an open syllable or a closed syllable.
Yeah.
And the kid, goes, why hasn't anyone ever told me this before?
Oh, yes.
And
no one's explained why it's table and not tabble.
They have a revelation that is a genuine, oh, my God.
Yeah.
Suddenly you see the whole world of reading unravel for them and they go,
this isn't completely random.
I have those, there are moments you can kind of predict that that's going to happen during the program.
Yeah.
You can see with open and closed syllables is that first magical moment of oh my God.
Yes.
This is how it works.
Yes.
When you introduce suffix and kids go,
it's a part of the word and it does this job. And teachers go, now I can actually explain this. I don't just have to say, well, want and washing and swan and was and wasp are weird words. I can say to them, if you put an A after a W, the vast majority of times it's going to say the ot sound. This isn't random.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And so it's both sides of the fence.
It is.
Get a positive result from it, a big positive result.
A huge positive result.
A life-changing result.
Yes.
I see for kids.
Yeah.
From something as simple as teaching them a spelling rule.
Yep.
And they go, I can do this.
I see groups of adults this delighted when I teach them some of this stuff.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Or I say, why did you put a K there and not a C? And the kid goes, because it's before an E. And they go, hey, I did it. I know how to do this.
I had a kid just the other day do something like that, and they said to me, how did I know to just do that?
Yeah.
I think it might have been K in front of me. And I said, because you've automatized it. All that hard work, you've locked it in, and that's what we're doing.
Yeah. So, it's all positive.
Yeah.
This is the message I'd like to get across is I see so much online of people just attacking each other.
Yes.
It is turned into an us and them.
Oh, we've gone tribal. It's gone tribal.
And it's become personal attacks.
Yeah.
It's become, labeling people on both sides as dumb or stupid or, there's no hope for you because you're stuck in this ideology.
But it's such good fun, Michael. But it's not helpful, you're right.
But it's not helpful and it just makes the change we need harder.
Yeah, because when people go to their corners, they shut their ears.
Yeah.
And they hold their hands over their eyes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, you're right. It's look, it's been called the reading wars for a very good reason, what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And there's been people have rightly said we need to end this. But we also have to be really, really clear and candid about what way of teaching gets the best results. There's also been these straw man arguments. People on the whole language Look, hang on. Let's be careful because I'm tribalising again. We all want kids to learn to read, and everyone, no matter where they sit on this, they all agree we want kids to learn to read as well as they can, as quickly as they can, and spell as well.
Yep.
We need to automatise all these processes as quickly as we can, so kids then have room for the higher order stuff.
Yep.
So we're all on the same page there. But yeah, we've poked fun at each other. People who are critics of synthetic phonics say this is boring. This is denying kids exposure to rich literature, and we're just making phonics robots. And the phonics side have said, well, you guys just think about higher level stuff, but willingly and knowingly leave all these kids behind, which isn't the case. But yes, there have been many shots fired.
Yeah. Continuing to be, but we are making progress.
We're getting there. South Australia introducing the phonics check was huge. It was a big moment. Big moment for us here in South Australia.
Yep.
Big moment for the country, I'd argue. We covered that with Dr. Sandra Marshall in the last podcast. But yeah, so
we've got the phonics check. The running records are gone.
They are going and gone, and it's not before time.
Yep, and we are right here on the verge of the new old revolution in teaching reading.
That's right. The stuff that the baby did get thrown out with the bathwater. Yeah. Alison Clark puts it beautifully. Phonics went out with the cane and milk at recess time. I'm not sure if she said the milk. But yes, in order to be progressive, and I'm doing air quotes, phonics was one of those things that was jettisoned as old hat.
Yes, but we welcome it back with open arms.
We do.
Both kids and teachers.
Yes.
And it's a bright future, I think.
Oh, yeah. And schools are seeing the results right now, Michael.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we just have to all just kind of put up with this transition pain. Change is always difficult and stressful and always makes people anxious, me included.
And angry and ashamed.
Yes.
And
So we just have to kind of fight through that, knowing that it's for a greater good.
Yeah. I think that's really well put. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Michael.
And thank you to everybody out there who's joined us today. Remember, you can visit discastia.com to get all the show notes and links to the resources and videos that we've mentioned in the episode. And you can subscribe to get notified whenever we release new episodes.